If you're out flying your favorite airplane on a beautiful VFR day under a blue sky with light winds and a stable air mass and no turbulence, and you're thinking nothing bad is ever going to happen to me, you're in for a big surprise and you're not going to like it. Welcome back to the channel. It's great to have you along for the ride. If this is your first time tuning into MadPropsAero, we appreciate you. Thanks so much for coming by. Our mission is basically to entertain and educate folks who are general aviation enthusiasts in various aspects of general aviation you might not be thinking about the way you probably should. And let's be honest, we could all use some insight into some of the various oddities general aviation can throw our way. Recently, we received a message from a viewer that I have a feeling when they were writing it, they were thinking, this is a stupid question. But of course, as we know, there are no stupid questions. And ironically enough, just after we got this message and responded to it, an incident turned into an accident that really illustrated why this particular question isn't stupid at all. The question was this: do pilots really know what all the knobs and switches and buttons in the cockpit do? The short answer is yes, they do. The more accurate answer is they should, but not all of them do. And that could be a problem. Let's say you're a private pilot applicant on a check ride with an examiner, a designated pilot examiner, and you're flying an airplane that has an autopilot installed in it. And the examiner says, hey, why don't we use the autopilot to take us through one leg of this planned cross country? And you say, I don't know how that works. That's kind of a problem. At the very least, that's going to be a post-flight debrief item with your examiner. Depending on how the rest of the check ride goes, it might actually lead to a busted check ride. Now, that's not actually the applicant's fault. That's a failure on the CFI's part. That's something we really need to understand. Education is a major part of being safe in aviation. For any applicant, for any pilot to be safe and good, they have to actually understand how the systems in the aircraft work. Let's consider an essential but common system pretty much every airplane has, a system that has variations in it that we really have to understand in order to operate the airplane safely. And I'm talking about the fuel system. A high-wing airplane generally will use a gravity feed fuel system because the fuel is in the wings up high, the engine is down a bit lower. So just gravity will feed it down. And because of that, the fuel selector may have 4 positions: left, right, both, and off. That's a common thing. And you can select, I just want to feed off the left tank, I just want to feed off the right tank. I often fly with both, and I can turn the fuel off if I need to. 4 options. Now, in a low-wing airplane, gravity is not going to feed that fuel uphill to the engine. So we need to have an electrical boost pump to help the engine-driven fuel pump. And by the way, engine-driven fuel pumps are very reliable. They rarely fail. But if you're in a low wing, it makes sense, especially on startup after the airplane's been sitting for a while, to have that electrical fuel pump to pump the fuel uphill, put some pressure into the system. Because this is a low wing pumping fuel uphill, we generally don't have the both option. The fuel selector will say left or right or off, but we can't take from both, just because if one goes empty and the pump is running, it'll pull the air rather than the fuel. Not great. This is a really good example of why it's not really good enough to just know how to fire up the engine, tug on the controls, point the airplane more or less where you want it to go, and fly. Somewhere along the line, something's going to happen that you didn't expect. If you're flying around thinking nothing's ever going to go wrong, you're in for a big surprise one day, and not the kind that you're going to enjoy. Trust me on this. So this general conversation pretty much answers the viewer's question. Do pilots really need to know what all the knobs and switches and buttons do in the cockpit? Yes, they really should. But the surprise for us was right after responding to that, there was an incident in Pearland, Texas, where a fellow was on a sightseeing flight essentially in a Grumman AA-5, very nice 4-seat all-metal low-wing airplane, and he had a problem that he apparently wasn't prepared for and reacted to in a way that wasn't necessary and really made the situation much worse. Here's the scenario. They depart a non-towered airport in Texas. They're flying around doing their thing and they suffer a complete electrical failure. Now, when the electrical failure happens, they lose their lights, they lose their radio, and in the Grumman, they lose their flaps. But it's daytime. It's VFR, and it's a really nice day. This is an inconvenience, not an emergency. It's not really that big a deal. And it actually is a really good reason why you might want to carry a handheld radio with you when you fly, even if there's one installed in the airplane, because that's a totally separate thing. And you can go ahead and communicate with other aircraft or with a tower in a pinch should your electrical system or just your radio fail. Now, we're in class golf airspace, so there is no requirement that we use radios, but it would be nice, and everybody appreciates it when we do our position reports. But it would have been even better had the pilot remembered that the electrical system for the engine is completely separate from the electrical system that runs the airplane. The lights and radio and flaps are run off the alternator and battery system. The engine runs off a pair of magnetos. It's completely separate. There is no connection between those two systems. So although we lost the power to the radios and the lights and the flaps, the engine is running fine. There is no problem. We're in cruise flight. Life is good. Unfortunately, the pilot, for some reason, seems to have felt he had an emergency and needed to make an emergency landing, or at least a very hasty precautionary landing right now, right here. Now, let me throw in here, I've had this exact scenario happen. I had a complete electrical failure coming out of Key West, which was a much smaller airport back then, but an international airport. I'm in the air beside an international airport and an active Navy base with an airfield, and I've got no radio. I've got no lights, and it's going to get dark. You could freak out over this, but I was aware. My engine's running fine. I have a full tank of fuel. I don't have a big problem. I have an annoyance. So I just turned around, went back, circled the tower, got light gun signals, landed at Key West. No big deal, because I knew my engine was going to continue to run just fine. And the fact that I didn't have flaps was not that big a deal. I practice no flap landings all the time. I've had to do it for real, so I practice it. That way, whenever it does happen to me, it's just an inconvenience. It's not something to get all excited about. We even had a video on this very channel not that long ago where I was flying with a young woman and we had a flap malfunction in the airplane. So we just didn't use them. We just pulled them up and just continued our flight normally and did a no flap landing when we got to the airport. No big deal. A system failure is only a problem if you don't understand how the system works. Most of the time, it's just an inconvenience, and we can handle an inconvenience. An emergency, that's a whole other thing. Unfortunately for this pilot, he seems to have gotten a bit flustered, and he did make that emergency landing right here, right now. The problem became there was a Cessna 182 on final when the pilot of the Grumman decided I have to land now. And the Grumman doesn't have any way to communicate with the Cessna or anybody else, so he's just following in trail behind the Cessna 182. And since he's making a no-flap landing, his airspeed and ground speed are a little higher than it might be otherwise. The Cessna touches down right on the center line, does a beautiful job. The Grumman touches down on the runway not that far behind the Cessna. Now think about it when you fly. You land, you're rolling out, you're at idle. You might even add a little bit of brake or aerodynamic braking to slow the airplane down to make that first turnoff, or maybe the second turnoff. But the Cessna pilot has no idea there's somebody right behind him. The Grumman barrels right into the Cessna. When they collide, the Grumman's propeller is still spinning. The engine is still producing power, which led to substantial damage for both airplanes. This entire accident could have been avoided if the pilot of the Grumman had realized, I don't have an emergency, I have an annoyance, I have an inconvenience. I've lost my electrical system, but I don't need my electrical system here. The only real difference that should have happened here is this would have been a no-flap landing for a Grumman pilot who could have just flown out, entered the pattern on a 45, flown downwind in a very organized fashion, given himself some space, because there's a reason we only allow one airplane on the runway at a time. And this is it. They can collide, and that's not a good thing. Fortunately, there was no fire. If you want to get more deeply into this, The Blanco Liario channel on YouTube has an excellent breakdown and actually will give you a cockpit tour of a Grumman AA5. It's really good. It's 2 videos. I'll put links in the show notes. It's well worth a look. Very well done. But of course, the upshot of all this is, yes, a pilot really should know what all the knobs and switches and buttons in the cockpit do. Maybe more importantly, they should understand the systems that those knobs and switches and buttons activate. Whether that's an electrical system, a hydraulic system, a pneumatic system, it doesn't really matter. Whatever's there, we should understand how it works, because someday, if you fly long enough, something's going to fail on you. And generally, that's not that big a deal. And it doesn't matter if it's you picked up some carb ice, you lost an airspeed indicator because a bug flew into the pitot, or the electrical system failed, like happened in this case. You don't really need everything to be working perfectly in order to fly safely. You would like it, but the reality is things do break. And if we understand how the system works and we understand what our options are, we can make good, safe, timely decisions and react to the problem in a reasonable manner. Now, as always, I'm not making fun of the Grumman pilot. Fortunately, everybody walked away from this, no serious injuries, but 2 airframes are damaged, and 1 pilot is really humbled. Take that as a little bit of incentive for you to maybe pull out the flight manual on your airplane next time you fly, or better yet, before you fly, run through the systems and make sure you really understand how they work. Maybe even book some time with a CFI and go fly and simulate some failures, whether that's an engine failure, an engine fire, an electrical system failure, a radio outage, a flap failure, whatever it is. Practice it, because if you can do it in a simulated environment, when it actually happens to you, just as happened to me in Key West years ago, it's not that big a deal. We don't need to get excited. We've got an airport, we've got a flying airplane. Let's just find an organized, safe way to put those 2 together. Thanks so much for watching. I really do appreciate you coming by. I hope this thought process is helpful to you, because flying is a wonderful, wonderful way to spend your time. It's just a life-enriching experience, but it is important for whoever's taking the PIC role to really know how this works. Not just under blue skies where everything's working, even when the weather turns bad and a system fails. Let's make sure we're safe whenever we fly. And I'll see you right back here at the MadPropsAero channel next time.